I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you that if you like the work here I do at Parallax Views, I could really use your support at patreon.com/Parallax Views. One more time, that's patreon.com/Parallax Views. I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors, so it is you, the listener, that will help to ensure that this show keeps going and growing. So, if you can, please make a monthly donation at patreon.com/Parallax Views. With that out of the way, we have yet more coverage of the situation in the Middle East. We'll talk a little bit more about Gaza in this conversation, but also Syria, Iran, Israel. We're getting into all of it on this edition of the show with Reason Magazine's Matthew Petti. Matthew is an old friend of the show. He used to write at Responsible Statecraft, and I decided to bring him back on. Reached out to him, and he agreed to come back on the show to discuss everything we are seeing unfold in the Middle East. We covered a lot of ground, and you're going to hear 2 episodes with Matthew. In this episode, you'll hear his analysis of the situation in the Middle East, and in another episode, much shorter, only around, maybe 17 to 20 minutes long, we discussed the recent panic over drones being seen in places like New Jersey. I felt that it was important to split the episodes up as we sort of dealt with 2 different topics. On one end, we're dealing with the Middle East, and then in another portion of the conversation, we're talking about, this whole drones over New Jersey, drone invasion issue. So you'll hear that in the next episode with Matthew Petti, but in this episode you'll hear his analysis of the Middle East situation, and I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Matthew Petti of Reason Magazine. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I haven't had on in some time, but he is a returning guest. I'm very happy to have him on. Matthew Petti is an assistant editor at Reason and a proud New Jersey native. He has previously reported for the BBC, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, New Lines Magazine, Responsible Statecraft, Middle East Eye, and The National Interest, among other publications. And thank God for Reason Magazine writing such a great bio there for me to use. In 2022, Matthew was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to research the ways in which Arab journalists interact with foreign media. And it has some bangers when it comes to his social media tweets and posts. So we're going to be talking all about the Middle East.
My nightmare is always to be introduced. Like, you've seen those congressional hearings where they blow up a tweet into human size and point at it. That's always my nightmare, to be introduced by that.
Well, I guess to start out, what do you think people are? I mean, I've done a number of shows looking at what's happening in Syria. We don't have to relitigate and talk about everything that has transpired in the past few days. What we do need to talk about, though, I think for my audience, is What do you think people are getting right, and what do you think people are getting wrong about what's happening right now?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of this, a big sort of, I guess, I don't know, you call it anti-imperialist or non-intervention, like the sort of, you know, anti anti-Assad view or something was that, you know, the rebels are Al Qaeda and the United States is funding out when it supports the rebels is funding Al Qaeda. And I think that this is actually missing the point. I think a big problem with, I mean, I understand why people were concerned about extremism in Syria because of ISIS, right? That was a pretty big threat to uh, everyone, including Syrians. But I think what gets glossed over is just the sort of disorganization of the opposition and the sort of gangsterism and infighting and just naked factionalism and that was what a large part of the problem with the sort of opposition and a lot of the killing, even a lot of the sectarian killing. I mean, some of it was, ideological extremists who are reading from a book and being like, we need to enact this, and some of it was just gangsterism, right? Of people who had been terrorized by their Christian or Alawite neighbors for years, and then they finally have a gun and they can go get their revenge. And this sort of, I guess, revolution that happened over the past week. I mean, you could say it was the unfreezing of the civil war, but it didn't seem like there was much fighting. It seems like it just, happened. I almost think, I don't want to say something that get me arrested, but I almost think that Jolani taking over is like the sort of least bad thing that happened. The Assad regime just swiftly collapsing, doesn't really have any popular consent or support anymore, and then uh, people kind of cautiously allow a single unified rebel force to just march into Damascus. There's no bloody battle for the capital. There's no infighting, and I mean, you hear sort of crazy things coming out of the countryside and revenge killings and lynchings and such, but HTS itself, that's so yeah, the new sort of leader of Syria is Muhammad Jolani. I think he also goes by the name Ahmed Shara, but everyone knows him as Jolani, and his organization is called the Levant Liberation Committee, or HTS, and it's a former franchise of Al Qaeda, and it is now the government of Syria. And yeah, as I was saying, I think the fact that you have one leader who's susceptible to a lot of international pressure, knows that he has to manage uh, internal dynamics very carefully, but is also uh, also, one single leader and one single return address and sort of one single command structure is probably the least bad way this could have gone down. Uh,
It's
you know,
interesting that you say that because I think you've been misunderstood on that point based on what I've seen on social media. Because I think you've been very critical of, you don't think we should whitewash Jelani's past. But I think some people will attack you and say, well, no, you're just trying to, undermine Jelani, or you're supporting Iran, which is not what you're really doing at all. In my view, I think you're saying we just can't whitewash Jelani's past if we're going to deal with the present.
yeah, I mean, it's insane to me. It's insane to me some of these people who will, you know, look at something like October 7th and basically treat this as like an unforgivable sin on not just on the part of Hamas, but on the part of the whole Palestinian nation and, anyone who's felt, any negative feeling towards Israel ever is now liable for every murder and kidnapping that happened on October 7th. But then, you know, they're suddenly whitewashing Jolani and treating him as like this soft, cuddly, neoliberal. There's all these memes. It was funny to see like neoliberal Jolani memes or inclusive Jolani memes, and he had a line in one of his communiques, "Diversity is strength," which was just goofy, but like we can't these are memes, like we can't forget this guy was a warlord and a sectarian warlord. And I mean, you can go read the Human Rights Watch is not an Assadist Baathist organization or something, and they wrote some pretty nasty things about or they wrote about some pretty nasty things that Jolani and his allies did during the 2013 offensive in Latakia, for example. That's Latakia, I guess, in English. I mean, yeah, like the guy, the guy is iron-fisted, and part of the reason why this happened so bloodlessly was because he was iron-fisted, because he pretty like cleanly, or not cleanly, but he pretty decisively brought all of the other opposition groups to heel under his command in Idlib, right? It was almost uh I forgot who said it to me. I think it might have been Brace Belden of Sure or Not. It was a private conversation. I shouldn't have doxed him like that, but it was like the sort of
Brace
Asana.
listens to the show, by the way, so
Oh, geez. Uh, but the the sort of Russian Turkish agreement on it was called the Astana arrangement was that like sort of Idlib was carved out as this one zone that would be held by the opposition. Assad would take over the rest of Western Syria, and the sort of logic of Astana was like, shove them all in Idlib and they kill each other, right? Until Jolani comes and kills them all. But right, again, the fact that he's like a disciplined, organized guy who's accountable to this revolutionary coalition is preferable to like gangsterism. I say gangsterism like there's these sort of quote moderate unquote Free Syrian Army groups, a lot of them just became mercenaries for Turkey, and their behavior in the areas that Turkey invaded, the Kurdish areas that Turkey invaded, was just, it wasn't like, oh, these people are jihadists, like they're bad because they want to do ISIS, impose a theocracy and wage war against it. It's like, no, they're bad because they're stealing and raping and killing, and they don't have any ideology. They're using their guns to just exercise power nakedly. And I mean, I remember this sort of, I think it was 2020 or maybe it was a little later, but a lot of these Turkish-backed mercenary groups ended up in conflict with Jolani, and he just wiped the floor with them. His forces just basically forced them to heel, and like a lot of Kurdish people, for example, who are not fans of, Al Qaeda or jihadism or anything, were almost had this like grudging respect, like thank you, man, for doing this. And again, I don't think we should whitewash him, but like, and I don't, and right, I I don't think we should be doing regime change against Syria again. I think we should be cautiously hopeful and let that
well, that's what
country
I was going
slip.
to ask you. Do you think that the US and other countries should just deal with the fact that HTS and Jelani are now in charge? I mean, I think that would be the smart move at this point. I mean, I think they're going to have to deal with the fact that this is the new order.
Yeah, I mean, right? The sort of anti-sanctions position was, I mean, okay, there are some people who like Bashar al-Assad. I was actually kind of shocked at some of the like people doing like last Japanese soldier on an island in 1975, like Assad did nothing wrong kind of freaks. But I mean, the actual serious anti-sanctions position was not like, oh, the Assad regime is a good thing. It was like the civil war is over. So people thought. Turns out it wasn't true. The logic was that the civil war is over and that Syria should just be allowed to rebuild and that the West should just stop trying to mess with its internal politics and just leave, just let people have peace. And I think that is still true. There's a different regime in Damascus. I made a joke like, oh yeah, if you're a true regime apologist, you shouldn't care who the dictator is as long as, but I mean, if you're a true anti-interventionist, I think, yeah, it shouldn't matter to you who the government of Syria is. Just leave it alone, right? I think that, a Jolani dictatorship is going to be I don't think that he'll be able to impose his will as like a Stalin type absolute dictator. I think Syrians are absolutely going to push back against that. I think that like, yeah, this is a process that we on the outside should let play out. I don't think we should be playing cheerleader for anyone. I think if right the what we can do as outsiders is you know make people come to the table and let reconstruction investment, not even aid, just let investment come into Syria, right? There's going to be a lot of like opportunities for reconstruction contracts and such. Just let that, the US had a law basically called the Caesar Act, and it was sold to the public as this like it's sanctions that punishes Assad and his family specifically and his cronies specifically. And there were some personal sanctions on like Assad can't go to Disneyland. Fine. But the part they never talked about was that it was also designed explicitly to deter any reconstruction happening under Assad controlled areas, right? And that was very sadistic. It was like if he can't have it, no one can. And I think again, if we were to just roll over and say have the same exact attitude if not let because Jolani is a terrorist, not let Syria rebuild under his rule. I think that would be a horrible mistake. That would be terrible. Just let Syria, now that they seem to finally have, and I don't think it's over. I think there are some fault lines we can talk about that are pretty dangerous. I think the U.S. should absolutely try to avoid inflaming those fault lines. Stop U.S. allies.
My not to interrupt you, but my issue is so what I sort of keep telling people, my formulation, and I'm not the expert, so I'm I'm just reporting on this stuff is I think Jelani, now that he is in power, may have to moderate on some things. I don't think that people are necessarily wrong to say, okay, well, people can change. He used to be involved with Al Qaeda. What I do think, though, is that you're still going to get a conservative Islamist regime. And I think HTS had some pretty strict laws in Idlib that I think that's also going to be the case in Syria now. It may not be run the way ISIS would run things, but it's going to be a pretty Islamist authoritarian regime. Maybe just not the worst case version of it, I guess.
Yeah, well, I don't think the U.S. should be doing some kind of violent, destabilization thing in Iran either, even though it's a conservative government. Like, yeah, I would say that I don't know. I like living in a place with social freedoms. That's why I'm here. But I don't think that, we should be violently trying to stop other places from having conservative governance. And if Syrians, and I think, Syria, like Iran, is a country with a big urban middle class. Unlike Iran, actually, it has a much big, Iran is nominally 95% Shia Muslim. Of course, there's, people can change religions or leave their religion or be not religious, but everyone's starting from the same cultural base. In Syria, I mean, it's like what, 60, 70% Sunni Muslim Arab, and then, a lot of, Arab religious minorities and a lot of non-Arab minorities. I think, and again, like a large educated urban middle class. I think there's going to be, it's not going to be smooth sailing. These politics are going to be contested. I think the point I'm trying to make is like, don't muck this up. Don't go in and start relitigating the Civil War as outsiders. And I mean, I guess it's like it's easy to say as someone who's not living in Syria, but I think it's almost less of a concern whether, alcohol is allowed to be sold or whether, people can have mixed beaches. Those are important social freedoms, I think, but like the bigger concern is whether communities come under attack, right? Whether they start doing reprisal attacks against Christians and Shia and Alawites and such. And I think that's a much bigger danger. And I also kind of think that like that's something that they really can't that Jolani knows he can't afford to allow. There are all these reports of pretty nasty reprisal attacks and stuff happening, but you know, fingers crossed, hope of hopes that this is not the Jolani regime doing it. This is just post-revolutionary chaos, and that once he consolidates, he's going to like cut this out. And if he doesn't cut this out, then it might risk reigniting the civil war.
Yeah, and I can see what you mean by being very wary of regime change. I think there's criticisms one can make of the Islamic Republic, but I also don't know that I would want it to be overthrown by like a return of the Pahlavi dynasty. It's I think these issues are complicated, and some people look at things in too much of a black and white manner.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we talk about Iran, all that's a whole separate conversation. There's gonna be some crazy things ahead, and
I wanted to ask you about those things.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I think right. I mean, Pahlavi is just such an the thing is like monarchism in Iran is I think something with a lot more popular peer than monarchists. Like there is a basic normie, like I don't like how my life is now, and I'm going to go on social media and look at like 40 years ago nostalgia, Iran before the Islamic Revolution. People make fun of the memes, but it's like that is for Iranians, that's just nostalgia content. And the idea that like yeah, we went wrong with the revolution or something like that is just a very basic normie idea, but the monarchists themselves don't really seem to know what to do with that. Like they have all the soft power that you just can't translate into any kind of ability to shape events in Iran. Um, and you have Pahlavi just kind of like running on the coattails. I mean, he's also so blatantly like an Israeli proxy. They gave him a tour of Israel and made him sit in a sad little plastic chair, and the person giving the tour is the intelligence minister. So like he's just left like chasing, whatever thing is in the sort of Israel sphere. Um, and not really commanding things. And then like his inner circle in the US is a joke. I mean, who knows? Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe a year from now he will be sitting on the peacock throne again, and Iran will be a monarchy, and he'll actually have been playing the long game. But I think if there is something is going to give in Iran, but what's more likely to give is something within the internal structure of like the post 1979 you know I say the regime, I mean like the whole society, the whole social structure. And I think like even now you kind of see hints of it with like I don't know if you've heard anything about the hijab, speaking of conservative social laws.
Right. I was gonna say there's some reforms happening.
Not even reforms, but they've just kind of hit the brakes on some of the more so basically right after the 2022 uprising. Uh, there was basically hijab enforcement like went out of fashion, and they kind of just lost their grip on these things, and people just go dressed. I mean, it varies where you are, and there's some risk, and they do crackdowns once in a while, but people are defying this en masse, and I think there have been some recent efforts by the kind of Iranian right to just crack down on sort of hijab non-compliance in some really ugly, heavy-handed ways. And there was this, I don't even remember what the specific content of the law was, but I just remember it was like really bad and ham-handed. And then Khomeini had kind of given a nod to it. And then the National Security Council of Iran just like, nope, nope, we're freezing this. We're suspending enforcement of it. And it almost feels like this is the first test case of like a sort of Harris to Biden kind of, Biden to Harris kind of soft coup where, the leadership of the Khamenei is just this old guy and his priorities are completely wrong. And like the sort of adults in charge are just kind of trying to wrestle the steering wheel away from him.
Right. I was gonna say that council you mentioned being in disagreement with Khomeini is, pretty relevant, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that people have talked about for like years and years is that the sort of Iranian military deep state is going to push the clergy out of the way, and then it will still be like like the same structure of the Islamic Republic, but it'll just be run very differently by different factions, and it'll be sort of a more pragmatic, less ideological, I know those are words you can kind of you've got to interrogate, and there's a lot you can tease out there, but um yeah, I think that is a sort of way things are trending, assuming there's no like
I,
violent
I think it's
rupture
a
or
very how do I put this? A lot of people will look at the Islamic Republic and I think they have a lot of preconceived notions about it. And I have very strong criticisms of the Islamic Republic, but I also think it can be a pretty rational actor, and I think it's very adaptive, to be honest.
I mean, I would have said that 5 years ago, but I think the past few years, just something has gone haywire. The social structures have been really, not the social structures, the political structures have gotten really calcified and I think stubborn. And I mean, I guess we'll see. They certainly didn't handle the last year very well.
Well,
I
that
think
that is true. Yeah.
to the detriment of them and also like Arabs under their protection and like Palestinians. Um, of course, this is a criticism you'll never hear in DC, right? They'll say, "Oh, Iran made a lot of blunders," and then you ask what the blunder is, and it's like, "Well, 40 years ago," but their actual blunder was not doing well enough to counter Israel, and now that Israel got what it wanted, it's been able to kill a lot of people in its neighborhood. But of course, no one in DC will say that because who's going to say, "Oh, we want Iran to defeat Israel" or something. Um, right? Nobody's going to say they're all rooting for Israel, even if they kind of feel bad about it.
So with the incoming Trump administration and also with Israel going for broke, I mean, do you have any concerns about U.S. foreign policy towards Israel going forward? I mean, I know a lot of us are burned out on the for years I've heard, oh, there's going to be a war with Iran. But I still worry about it in the back of my head sometimes. An
Oh no,
actual
I
like
think the
conflict.
Israelis are absolutely. I mean, it's some of their officials have straight up said, this is you can find this in the Times of Israel and stuff that this is time to attack Iran. And I think they have in Washington, they have a very strong case, right? Like Iran has been fumbling, and it's sort of Arab, it's Arab allies or proxies or empire, whatever you want to call the axis of resistance is retreating. And they're quote naked. That's what Jared Kushner said, that they're naked. So I think there is going to be an idea of like, yeah, let's just go for the knockout punch, right? It hasn't cost us anything so far. I think an actual like invasion of Iran would cost the US a lot, but I think the real danger, and I think everyone knows that too, which is why the Hawks would never ever admit that that's what they were pushing for. But I think the danger is that someone sells to Trump of like you could just bomb them, just do a little limited war, just one hit, bro, I promise. And then we end up in a full-scale war. And especially because, the Lebanon war ended up going much better for Israel. And, it went terrible for Lebanese people, by the way. But it went much better for Israel than people expected. Um, and so I think a lot of the sort of restraint-minded people in Trump's orbit might sound or feel like that they were crying wolf. And that's something I'm very worried about. On the other hand, I mean, Iran could just be building a nuclear bomb now, and we haven't heard anything about it. No one's found out about it. And then, you know, they test a bomb, and suddenly that's just off the table, right, to invade.
In terms of Gaza, I mean, is there much more that can be said? It just seems like everything has gone to hell in a handbasket, and I don't know what to say to my Palestinian friends anymore because I mean, it's we're just witnessing a horror show.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll say this. I think the Hawks in Washington were kind of they were kind of proven right in the sense that like if you just use infinite amounts of violence, you can just destroy everything. You can be king of the rubble. Like, yeah, that was always possible, but all right, you're king of the rubble. It's like what is this? Or I wrote an article in the American Conservative, The Axis of Misery, right? There's all this sort of gloating of like, the axis of resistance. That's what the sort of pro-Iran empire slash proxies slash alliances
By the way, real quick on the axis of resistance thing, I want to see if you agree with me on this. I hate that term and I hate the way it's used because a lot of people use that term to act as if Syria, Hezbollah, and Iran, and sometimes Hamas, even though Hamas often butted heads with Assad, Syria, it almost acts like this was like the NATO of the Middle East, like the Iranian anti-Israel, anti-US hegemony force when I think all of those players have their own interests. I mean, it's an axis, but it's not like a an actual organization. Like I
well, the
think
term
some people
actually,
treat it. Mhm.
I think the term was Hezbollah coined it or something. It was sort of a play on axis of evil. That
Right, right,
was
right. But I think the
yeah.
way some American pundits use it is
I mean, there was a kind of, I mean, it was like an alliance, right? It was a pretty, there was a lot of, lateral cooperation, and I think Iran, to some extent, was able to call the shots for, and of course, there's different levels of independence. But I think, look, even NATO, individual actors have their own sort of uh, agency, right? One of the things that Hawks will say is, well, how can you say NATO is like an American empire sphere of influence? Like Latvians want to be protected from Russia. It's like, yeah, and Lebanese Shia wanted to be protected from Israel, right? Um, in Iraq, I mean, the militias that Iran backs, a lot of them are very unpopular and corrupt, but they have a social base and a constituency, right? Like people did sign up for this. The Houthis in Yemen like that's just like an organic, and again, it doesn't mean that they're beloved by the whole country, but like that's an organic social movement with a base that like emerged and then sought out Iranian help. And so on and so forth. And Syria was always playing its own games. uh Assad was always sort of he kind of got subsumed under them after he lost his independence, through the civil war. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it is a collection of actors with their own interests who sort of united under an Iranian umbrella. We don't want to like pretend that Iran wasn't the power dynamic wasn't there. Like, right, Iran was the
Yeah, I don't
most,
want to ignore all that either. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I think the going back to what we are talking about, like the attitude in Washington is that the axis of resistance is done, and now, right now, it's going to be the land of milk and honey. It's like, well, what is the axis of submission done? Like, there's,
I wanted to talk about that term because I saw you coin that term to describe.
I mean, yeah, I mean, what's the opposite of resistance? It's submission. Axis of misery, axis of chaos and tyranny, axis of whatever you want to call it. Like the U.S. led order is kind of bulky, but right, whatever you want to call it, it's like it hasn't offered something good for defeated nations, right? I mean, if it wasn't enough to see in 2003 in Iraq and just the what the people want to compare this to 1989 where the Soviet Union collapsed, but the difference is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US tried very hard to integrate peacefully the post-Soviet countries into Europe and like at least in the western part of the Soviet bloc and give them a a sort of stable and prosperous prosperous place. Like the Abraham Accords is not that. It's like a few islands of prosperity and then of countries that were already within the US sphere and then the newly added or the newly conquered territories are just that's like years of violence. I mean, Iraq 2003, that country is still under sort of militia gangster rule, although Iran has bought those people up, so now we're supposed to be mad about it, but the US installed them, right? Syria, I mean, leaving aside, I think Jolani kind of came to power in spite of the US's efforts, but as soon as Assad fell, the first thing that US like Israel bombed 80% of the Syrian military and conquered a bunch of territory, and then Turkey started unleashing these gangsters against Kurds and trying to do its own little land grab. Um, and then, I mean, Gaza, like, right? Hamas is defeated. What is Israel offering? What does even surrender look like? It's just like on paper, they have these ideas of a day after that are just, you know, huddle people into, I think they call this horrible term, humanitarian bubbles, just huddle the starving, terrified population into these purpose-built prisons, basically, and brainwash them. 'Cause that's what de-radicalization means, or beat them out of having any identity. And that's just like the good scenario on paper, like the actual, what that is in practice is not ending the violence, just constantly raiding these like Mad Max style uh, anarchy zones and just shooting people and bombing people. I mean, right? This was not the order that the U.S. offered after 1989, and in the Middle East, it feels like it doesn't have to. That these aren't real people and they're not relevant to the world order, and so we can just,
That was one of the issues I had with the Abraham Accords is I mean, it's very much based on the idea, well, we'll get to Palestinians later, but we have to like make Israel feel safe with all these other countries first, and the Palestinians be damned for right now. And it's sort of just throwing them under the bus and saying, well, to hell with you. It doesn't, like their concerns are basically wiped away.
yeah. I mean, well,
I know I'm putting things a bit mildly, but
the whole premise, I think, in 2020 of the Abraham Accords, like the Palestinian issue is dead, right? Nobody cares, and they're just going to like kind of submit. And this was like a kind of a bipartisan view too, because you had the Biden people in 2020 saying like, oh, we don't really see a time horizon or for a two-state solution or something, which basically meant like, oh yeah, and like suck it up, you're under the boot now. I feel almost the rhetoric about like forgetting the Palestinian issue or leaving it aside is like, um, almost, almost, right. It's not like a passivity. It's just like actively keeping them under the boot. It's just active cooperate, right? The whole idea was that these Arab countries that had a cold peace with Israel, now you want to enlist them in like actively endorsing Israeli nationalism and actively saying that Palestine doesn't exist. I mean, you had all this like I wrote an article for Responsible Statecraft I can send you. You had all this excitement about interfaith Jewish Muslim stuff, but at the same time, I mean, the rhetoric that accompanied it out of Israeli and Arab media, not in English, not for Western consumption, was a lot of like very nasty vindictive stuff. You had Saudi media, basically calling Palestinians these like uptight parasites who, don't know how to appreciate. And you had, the Israeli government spokesman coming out and talking like stirring up Sunni Shia stuff and saying how like Shia are infidels and outside the fold of Islam. Um, right? It was the Abraham Accords was actively cementing this sort of axis of hatred, of an axis of kicking the guy who's the downtrodden, kicking them harder. And but the idea was like, right, that this would just kind of settle into a stable order, and the people who are supposed to be on the bottom would accept that they're on the bottom, and that's it. And after October 7th, I think that's changed, at least in some quarters, to an actual just like exterminationist vision of like, oh well, these people couldn't appreciate how good they had it on the bottom, so now we've just got to, you know, kill them all or something.
I mean, do you what do you think the most likely scenario is to play out for the Palestinians? I mean, I've had people say they just think it's become even more hopeless than it was a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of good things to say. I will say, I mean, I don't think
I've
Palestinians.
always maintained I don't think you can completely beat them into submission, but I just don't know. But go on.
Well, look, I'll put it this way: like Native Americans got wiped out, um, but or very wiped out to like a very high percentage, but this was with a huge technological difference and among peoples who weren't really politically mobilized and didn't have sort of um, modern nationalism. I think Palestinians won't go the way of Native Americans because you've got, an educated, a very strong educated diaspora, a very strong sense of identity. Um, you've got a lot of people in the world who sort of support this identity and a lot of actors in the world who want to make it real, which is why the Abraham Accords were, why there was so much focus on cultural normalization because it was sort of, make kind of get drain the Palestinian source of regional support. I don't think that's going away. Um, I think, I mean, even now, Israel has not managed the original, I think, thought of the Israeli leadership, and it was even kind of said explicitly on October 8th, was just push them all into Egypt and they'll just become poor Egyptians, and that hasn't happened. Partly because Egypt, for very selfish reasons, doesn't want to let it happen, but yeah, I think just there's not really anywhere to send Palestinians. I mean, Israel can try just like Nazi style full extermination in Gaza or something. Um, I mean, I don't know if they have the means to kill 2 million people, though God knows. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly like Palestinian society is in way worse shape than it was, 2 years ago. But I also just, you know, it's not going to disappear. And I think if there's any lesson from the creation of Israel, is like once you have a ethnic group with a sort of national identity and strong national connection to the land, and they're scattered around the world and highly educated, like they're going to come back. You're not going to get rid of them. I think if anything, Syria shows on a much shorter time scale, right? That the sort of the Idlib pocket, which everyone had sold, it was pretty terrible life there, but people had kind of sold it as just a done deal and it's gone. And then, you know, as soon as the opportunity presented itself, people came back. It came back. It you know took revenge on its oppressors, and it you know people came back home to Aleppo and Damascus who had been held in this sort of Idlib pocket. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that the Israelis have a way of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I think the society is very, very pumped up on overconfidence, and I think that them trying to take as much land as they can is not going to end well for them. I don't know. I mean, right? The problem is that a lot of these things take a lot of these dynamics take years to develop, and in that time, I mean, if you've killed between 50 and 100,000 Palestinians in a year and a half, I mean, right? Maybe you can kill 2 million people. I don't know. It's very dismal. It's very dismal. But I don't think it's hopeless.
What do you think? the overthrow of Assad means for, well, let's start with Turkey, and then we'll move around to the different players and how this affects them.
So I think Turkey definitely got more than it bargained for. I think Erdogan sort of greenlit this offensive. And it's funny because the offensive happening the day after the ceasefire in Lebanon, people were saying, oh, that proves Jolani's working hand in glove with Israel. It's like, no, that I kind of think that shows the opposite. It's like Jolani knew that he couldn't be perceived as Israel's co-belligerent in any way, so he waited until that wasn't the case. Um, but yeah, I think that Turkey initially wanted to maybe put some pressure on Assad in the north and get a deal with him to deal with the Kurdish question and deal with the refugee problem because those are Turkey's two interests in Syria, right? Make Syrians go home and prevent sort of Kurdish something in Syria that could lead to Kurdish unrest in Turkey. Um, And I think, yeah, they were negotiating with Assad in the months before he fell, and he was being very intransigent with them, which I think in the end turned out for a best case scenario, both for him and for both for Syria and for Kurds. Uh, Unintentionally, of course. And yeah, he's gone. And I think Turkey now is trying to take advantage of the opportunity because, first of all, with Assad gone and the Russians gone, more importantly, there's no real. The Americans who are another NATO ally, are the only real obstacle to Turkish air power. And I think, when we talk about the Syrian Kurdish revolution, it's not really Kurdish. Uh, Northeast Syria, the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria, which is what their little sort of republic is called, is actually more than 50% Arab. And part of this was just because of the reality of the anti-ISIS campaign, where these Kurdish forces ended up, having to capture and integrate Arab majority territories, and right, and I think a lot of Arabs joined this project because it was sort of the lesser of four evils, right? It was not Assad, it was not Assad, it was not ISIS, and it was not the sort of Turkish-backed gangster militias. Now that Assad is gone and there is a sort of stable Islamist government in Damascus, stable with a asterisk, a lot of these Arab components, and some of them already have defected, are looking to sort of break free of what they see as Kurdish domination. And I think Turkey is kind of sitting there licking its lips like, oh, we're going to watch this whole thing unravel. I mean, they already deployed their militias and directly sent in air power to take the city of Manbij, which was west of the Euphrates River. And I think to them that was sort of tying up loose ends, but it's also kind of like, where else are they going to push? The next one would be Kobani, which is a sort of border town famous for its last stand against ISIS, also pressed right up against the Turkish border. Um, and I mean, if Kobani falls, I think that this reignites the whole Kurdish issue across the Middle East. Um,
What do you think Turkey's? I mean, I'm very critical of Erdogan, and I think he has very expansionist sort of ambitions, but I could also see him just being only interested in Syria in regards to, as you said, the Kurdish question. What do you think Erdogan's end game is? Not just in Syria, but in general. Like, what does he want in terms of his foreign policy?
uh, I don't know. I think it's kind of a case now, like the Israelis, of like, we're going to push this as far as we can take it. Um, I do think to some degree he just wants to, like, the Arab state system has collapsed and he wants Turkey to be sort of, the sort of,
The leader of the Arab world, or
yeah, the leader of the Sunni Muslim Arab world, and also to be able to swing its weight around against other historic enemies like Armenia and Greece. But yeah, I think that's the vision. I don't think they're gonna like literally recreate the Ottoman Empire step by step, but I think they see Turkey as a sort of leader of this sort of Sunni Arab bloc, or this sort of Sunni Muslim or post-Ottoman bloc. But as you can say, it's just the Kurdish issue. Like, that's a pretty big just because
well,
I
that's
think
true. That's true.
Yeah, like the Turkish state, in a lot of ways, is similar to the Israeli states. Although I think the Israeli case might be a little more extreme right now. Um, Vision of security, where this ethnic group that is your kind of internal enemy also lives in the countries bordering you, and so you don't, as soon as like that state doesn't have sovereignty, you go and take as much as you can for the sort of ever expanding security rationale. I mean, like I said, the militias that Turkey empowered to rule over Kurdish areas in Syria were like nasty thugs, and also directly controlled by Turkish intelligence. And I think um, that is the kind of vision he has for Northeast Syria. I think for Western Syria, right, he's just going to deal with the Jolani government because he knows that Jolani is going to be very dependent on Turkey economically and diplomatically and such.
I think that's an interesting point you bring up, that there's maybe parallels between Turkey and Israel when it comes to the Kurds and the Palestinians. I mean, it's not a one-to-one, but
Yeah, there's lots
I
of differences in the dynamic.
right, but it is interesting because I think you comment on this, but there's always these people that say to me, "Why does no one on the left care about the Kurdish self-determination? They only care about the Palestinians." And I'm
I
like,
mean, our
"What are
friend
you people
Brace literally
talking
went
about?"
out. Like, there's so many
Wait, what
left.
did you say? I missed that.
Our friend Brace, like, well,
Yeah, he
man, he
fought.
literally fought. Like, there were leftists willing to take bullets for both. I mean, yes, I think there is. I think the Palestinian issue is more of a sort of pop culture trendy thing. But at the end of the day, like, all the sort of trendiness in the world doesn't do anything if you're under bombs. And I think if you're looking at what people actually being willing to like, put themselves in Syria, pay large costs for this. I think there is a lot of solidarity to go around for both.
Do you have any thoughts on what all this tumultuousness means for the situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan? Or
I don't want to speculate. I mean,
okay, I
yeah,
worry about the Armenians a lot. I think they've been through a great deal, but
yeah, I mean, Azerbaijan is really licking its lips now because it's an ally of both Israel and Turkey, and its axis of genocide, the sort of cornerstone of the axis of genocide. I mean, yeah, no, Azerbaijan had just the thing is that it was one thing for them to. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with what happened, but in I think August 2023, uh, there was this disputed territory, Karabakh, that had been disputed for like 30 since the fall of the Soviet Union, Armenian majority. A large number of Azerbaijanis had been expelled from it. Azerbaijan conquered it and basically expelled almost every last Armenian down to the man.
this was yeah, I think Armenians will always say it's Artsakh. It's yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Artsakh Karabakh. But yeah, I think there's one thing for Azerbaijan to take a internationally disputed territory that I think most countries had, I think even Armenia did recognize it as within the borders of Azerbaijan, even though it was had an Armenian government. So it's one thing for them to do that. I think it's another thing for them to press onto the sovereign territory of Armenia itself. But I mean, as we've seen over the past year, like it seems like all the old structures are coming apart, and it really is a game of how far you can push. And I think for Azerbaijan, for Armenia, I mean, it's a question of how much Russia and Iran are willing to stand up for its territorial integrity. you know, Another case where you're not allowed to say this in Washington, or nobody will say this, but like, you know, Iran and Russia are preventing ethnic cleansing in this case. They might not be doing a great job of it. They might not be the most well-resourced, but in this case, right, the forces of chaos and darkness are arrayed against these two countries.
Well, in closing, first off, is there anything else I missed that you wanted to cover briefly here? Anything you've written lately? I know you did that article on this, I guess, Syrian jailer that was interviewed by CNN.
Oh yeah, on the time of misinformation. Yeah, no, there was this thing where CNN's Clarissa Ward had so when the Assad government fell in Syria, the prisons opened up. That was sort of one of the biggest deals of the revolution because the Syrian prison system, I think, unlike even a lot of other repressive governments, it doesn't just, take people en masse, but it just disappeared them. People just disappeared off the face of the earth. There was no trial, not even a show trial or kangaroo trial. It's just like get taken at a checkpoint, someone sees something on your phone that they don't like a meme making fun of Assad or whatever, uh, puts you into a van, and then you just disappear into a prison, and no one, your family can't even figure out where it's horrible stuff. And I think it's happened to around 130,000 people throughout the war. And I mean, the Assad regime was really just like it really was like a prison state. And so when it fell, they opened the prisons and like they were finding people from like 30 years ago, people who had just completely assumed were like gone. It was very sad. It was very sad. It kind of sparked a lot of false hope, I think, in families whose loved ones had just been killed, but thought, oh, maybe they hadn't, maybe when they disappeared, they hadn't died. They're in like a secret. And there was all this like stuff where there's like the Sednaya Central Prison. People were saying there's hidden floors and we need to dig to the hidden floors where the oxygen runs out. It turns out there were no hidden floors, but I think it was like a very sad thing of like of this hope after all the prisoners are let out and your family member's not one of them. Like, what do you do? Anyways, this on the CNN thing, I think on a lighter note, um, was, they got one of these tours of one of the abandoned prisons and it had already been searched and cleared out, but they found a locked cell. So they're like, oh my God, there's someone in there. And so they make a big show of like they shot the lock off the door and um they find a guy under a blanket and he's like, "Oh my God, thank you, God, you found me." And they're like feeding him, and Clifford Ward's like embracing him and hugging him and like, "You're free now. Syria is free now." And after that, and CNN really advertises like, look at this remarkable moment that our journalists saw. And after the clip went up, a bunch of people recognized the guy. It turns out he was not a prisoner, or maybe he was a prisoner, but he was also a jailer. Um, and this photo of him surfaced in uniform, working for the same intelligence agency that was running this black site. And so one of the theories was that he basically, when the rebels had well, not the rebels now, they're the new government of Syria, but when the revolution had showed up to like open the prisons, and he didn't want to be, you know, killed or tried or whatever in reprisal, he just hid under a blanket, pretend to be a prisoner. Um, but the what was reported by local journalists, this outlet called Verify SY, was that he actually was a prisoner, but because he had pissed off that he had been extorting people for money, and it was like some corruption thing, and his boss threw him in his own prison. And then, he just made up some fake ID. Because that was the thing. He told CNN, like, oh, I've been here for 3 months and my name is Adel Ghorbal. It turns out there was no guy named Adel Ghorbal, and this guy, um, Salama Mohammad Salama, had been there for like less than a month. So, yeah, I think he was covering his own ass, and CNN. I mean, even if he was right, even if he had really been a prisoner, I think the way CNN approached it was very exploitative and kind of
I don't know
predatory.
what it is, but you have a knack for picking up stories of like media malfeasance.
I don't want to be the media critic guy, right? I want to be reporting original stuff, but
You're like
it's
the you incidentally become that at times though.
yeah, it's just because like if you're sharp, there's a lot. It's not. Look, I know war reporting's hard. Like, I don't want to be too hard on people. I don't think like it's sometimes stuff is moving really fast, it's and people are lying to your face, and it's like hard to verify. But also, some things are just like if you're sharp enough, you can kind of see like yeah, something's not right about this.
Well, hey Matthew, we'll have to do this again in the future. I really like having you on. You're one of my favorite guests. So, how can my listeners keep up with your work? Because you have your own Substack. You're also on Reason. Is there anything I'm leaving out? Anywhere else you write for?
Well, I occasionally freelance for places, but usually I'll put that on Substack if I do. Yeah, I mean, my full-time job is at Reason Magazine. I think you should read Reason Magazine and you should read me, but also the magazine in general, and that's where you'll find most of my original reporting. And I do have a Substack blog where I kind of just talk about like, thoughts that come to mind or sort of analysis of some situation where I'm not contributing anything original, but it's just like, all right, let me put these thoughts out. It deserves more than just a social media post.
Thanks again, Matthew Petti, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thank you, JG.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.